let me start with welcoming you all to this second webinar on how do we improve India's competitiveness with inclusive economic growth. The first webinar had witnessed some very good discussions. Some of you have been through the video recording. Even this is being video recorded. And I would encourage you to, we intend to hold a third one in March so that we're able to capture as many views as far as possible. The idea, of course, is very simple that, we are aware of the issues, the problems, etc., etc. But what are the things that we need to focus upon in terms of pragmatism in order to push the agenda on improving our competitiveness? This has been a bane for India. Quite often we find that we are not competitive in our exports, and therefore we are hesitant to even enter into FTAs. For example, the RCEP was one very major FTA that we did not join. And often industry keeps on speaking about the fact is that we are not competitive. And indeed, there have been many studies to show that the transaction costs which the Indian entrepreneurs face are much higher. For example, even electricity tariffs are much higher than what prevails in other countries, or interest rates, and so on and so forth. Now, we know most of these problems. There have been efforts made in the past by government to address them in a granular fashion. I mean, all these problems will have to be addressed in a granular manner in order to deal with them, and you pluck them one by one in order to see how it can be improved. One very major agenda of the government is how to doing ease of business. And we have been arguing for ease of running a business, in the sense that, constantly we find that what is worse, which is coming into our experience over a number of years that we've done a lot of field work to see the nuisance value of the bureaucrats for a running entity is tremendous. And they usually act like Shylocks to extract a pound of flesh, whether it is the lower administration officials or police officials, and so on. And we keep on coming across these instances again and again. Now, that said, that does impact competitiveness in one manner or the other, because the cost of production then goes up. Now, a lot of these issues are stuck in our sort of time warp, I would say. The discretionary powers, particularly resulting from ambiguous laws and regulations and practices, lead to problems for businesses to be able to do it. Fortunately, the dynamic Prime Minister has been speaking about it again and again, and he said it the second time that we must know how to respect our wealth creators, and we cannot be holding them to ransom, in the sense that we're not doing a favor by allowing them to do business, but they are doing a favor by creating jobs. Now, given all the circumstances, so what we do feel is that there is a strong political will to improve our competitiveness. And we have with us, for that matter, Gopal Krishna Agarwal, the economic spokesperson for BJP, with whom we've been having this conversation for a long time. And hopefully, through him, it can reach the policy circle that, look, these are the A, B, C, D, E things which need to be done in order to improve our competitiveness. Secondly, we are aware that we are a large quasi-federal country, and a lot of things have to be done by states, which again is a challenge on its own, in the sense that some states are doing better than the others, and therefore we have this what we call competitive federalism. And for example, a brilliant statement by the UP Chief Minister that when we talk in terms of a $5 trillion economy, he's made a statement about the fact that UP will contribute $1 trillion by 2035 to this dream of $5 trillion. Now, we are aware that this pandemic has thrown much of our thinking and much of our systems out of gear. So given that situation, how do we progress, and how do we, it becomes, in fact, as they say, a crisis always leads to better reforms, Gopalji. So I think the advantage that the government can use is this crisis that we have as to what is it which needs to be done. I'm glad one very important common denominator we see is the civil service, which often is a block. I'm not talking about top to bottom, right up to the Patwari and the Tehsildar, etc. It's not just the IAS or the favorite punching bags. And the Prime Minister has again made this point very clearly that we need to see how we can improve their performance. And one way they're doing it is through lateral entry, but I don't know how easy that would be. I'm reminded of an old experiment in 1971, 72, called the Industrial Management Pool, which had recruited people from the private sector at joint director, joint secretary levels, people like P.L. Tandon and so on. And that unfortunately lasted only one batch. They were not allowed to continue with that particular thing, which was a structured IMP, as it were, structured lateral entry, as it were. Another thing that we've been arguing is that in the armed forces, we already have the system of exit. So you were saying, why not lateral exit as well? At various levels, you find people becoming incompetent. At the entry level, they may have been very bright and brilliant. They join these services, but over time they start degrading or becoming useless. Even in the latest panel of 25 or so secretaries who've been appointed, I know 4 of them personally, and 2 of them I would have retired them as joint secretaries, while 2 of them I would have made them secretaries 5 years ago rather than today. Some of them are brilliant doers, etc., and some of them are absolutely hopeless. These are personal experiences, so I can say that with some certitude about what kind of civil service reforms are required. Now, being a large country is not simple. Why I'm stressing on civil service reform is because a lot of these problems need to be delivered. They are execution problems, implementation problems, and implementation has to be led by the administration. It cannot be led by the private sector all the time, or even think tanks or academics. You can only point out that this has to be done. So with that, let me welcome you all once again and request Surjit. Surjit has joined us from Washington, D.C. He is our executive director, ours plus a few other countries' executive director at the International Monetary Fund. It's quite late at night, but this being his love, so and our old friendship, that he thought that he would make the effort to be with us tonight. Over to you, Sujit. 5 to 7 minutes. We'll try to come back again and again to the panel, and therefore, any short pithy remarks that you would like to make would be more than welcome.
Yeah, thank you, Pradeep. And it's a pleasure to join this. It's I think, an important discussion. You've covered several of the points that I think needed emphasis. I'd just like to make 2 or 3 general points about trade, and which I think are not quite or are misunderstood. Let me start with something that we have all talked about ever since we were, or some of us were graduate students, etc., on protectionism, and that's holding Indian trade back, or Indian competitiveness back. Now, the world has changed a lot since 1970 and thereabouts. So I actually tried to go and look at the data on Indian protection. And what it turns out is that if you look at, and I'm excluding gold and excluding oil, that manufactured goods protection, as given by the average rate of protection, not going into involved calculations about the effective rate of protection, but the average rate of protection in India is quite low. And it's somewhere around 3 to 5% of non-oil, non-gold imports. And so I find it very difficult to think that protection is even an important cause of whatever problems we might think Indian trade has or Indian exports have or Indian industrial growth has. So I think we should take that out. There are many other factors that affect performance, but this is not one of them. Robert Lawrence from Harvard has a very interesting paper where he shows that across the world, developing countries have reduced tariff rates on their own. They are much below the WTO regarded or licensed rates. So again, making the same point that protection does not seem to be that important an issue in explaining almost anything because the levels are like 3-4%. And I like to, if somebody has a study or knows of a study that shows how minor changes of about half a percentage point can make changes in anything, any variable, I like to know. The second there's been a fair amount of, I think, misunderstanding about the role of exchange rates and real exchange rates in affecting trade performance. Again, this was a topic that HLAC committee looked at in detail. And what we came up with a conclusion is that really empirically, there is no relationship that we could find. This is for a sample of about 60 countries between 2000 and 2018. Now, there are two countries that have done phenomenally well outside of China. That's Bangladesh and Vietnam. And it's noteworthy that for both of those countries, the exchange rate has really appreciated along with their export growth, and appreciated not by 2 or 3 percentage points, but by something like 15, 20, 25 percentage points over the last decade or so. So I think, basically, the world has changed. There is a new macro, and there is, as you know, the Fed and ECB, et cetera, talking about lower for longer. Fiscal deficits, I speak from Washington, the House of Fiscal Deficit Hawks. And what is noteworthy is that, like the invisible hand, the fiscal deficit hawks are nowhere to be found anymore in Washington now. It could be the case that this is because of COVID, but I think it's going to be longer lasting than just a COVID year. And again, puts emphasis on the new macro that I think we all need to understand. Lastly, the traditional, for India, the traditional determinants of trade and performance and growth still hold. Real interest rates really matter, and governance matters, rule of law matters. Those are the areas where labor laws or lack thereof matter. So I think, the last 5 years have seen quite a significant change in many of these variables, and the last two in terms of interest rates, real interest rates. So I think you add all of that up, it augurs rather well for Indian growth recovery, as well as exports and other associated variables. So I conclude by saying I strongly believe there's a new macro. Some of our old beliefs are really not supported by any evidence whatsoever. And I think this is an empirical matter. We all have our priors, but I think we should bow down to empirical reality, a la Keynes. When the facts change, I change my mind. So I'll conclude with that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was a brilliant and very disciplined time that you took. And thank you for pointing out the very critical macros, which are very important for the topic we are seeing. Now, may I turn to Preetam Banerjee? Preetam has been a catalyst in this particular exercise that we're doing here, presented a paper along with Amit Kapoor of the Institute for Competitiveness, who's going to join us later. Preetam, if you can flag a few points that you think we may discuss, including responding to Surjit.
Thank you, Mr. Mehta. Very good morning to everybody. What I will try to do is link some of the points that were raised in the last meeting as well, and what Dr. Bhalla just discussed. So I think a very valid points made about protectionism per se and the impact it has for India's competitiveness. What we, the discussion last time really focused on precisely the areas that Dr. Bhalla mentioned. I think the big scope for reform is domestic. It's not about a tariff rationalization. It's about improving the competitiveness of the Indian economy and doing it in a manner that results in more equal growth or more inclusive growth. The one big theme that we discussed last time, which is important and is linked to what you were saying, Mr. Mehta, about the federal system. So how do we get the states? Because the states are actually the entities which are most responsible for governance in a large numbers of areas where industry is involved. So the governance of industry, whether it's of warehousing or transport or land or water or labor, all of these are basically managed by the state government. State government is therefore the last mile of governance in that sense. The center provides the macro structure, sometimes the regulation, sometimes not even that. So it's about the states. And one big kind of point that was raised last time was how do we get, let's say, a Bihar to become more like a Tamil Nadu? If we can get the laggard states to become more like some of our leading states, to what extent will that drive the growth path? The four pillars that we were kind of discussing last time, if we discuss the pillar related to what we call the intangible factors of that needs to be looked at, human resource development being the primary one. Over there, a big issue has always been that first we need to ensure that it's just not about government spending and government simply expanding the infrastructure and setting up new universities or schools, but it's also about the content of what is being taught, the governance of that education systems, and also the integration of academia with private sector at different levels. Will all of this be addressed by the new education policy is something that perhaps this group would like to discuss further. In being able to translate the vision of this more equitable, inclusive growth, which also leads to greater competitiveness for the economy, the other big point that we discussed was fair access. And there the critical point was about our MSME entrepreneurs and entrepreneurs in general having better access to credit. I think Dr. Bhalla mentioned that also in his intervention. Not just better access to credit, but the system of credit itself. How is it managed? How equitable it is? How objective it is in terms of assessing credit worthiness of even the smallest entrepreneur that approaches the system. The other big point that I think all of us discussed, and you also mentioned, was the regulatory burden overall. And again, that goes back to the whole point about the states being the key drivers, because at the end of the day, the interface between an entrepreneur or his agent who goes to, basically have any regulatory interaction, whether for a new enterprise to be set up or for an ongoing enterprise which needs to have a different interfaces with the regulatory ecosystem, is the state government that matters. And there we have to discuss how do we bring about institutional reform. And essentially the four big points that emerged from last time's discussion that perhaps the esteemed panel will like to discuss here as well is how do we basically increase institutional ability, meaning the competence of the officers who man these public institutions, and some private institutions as well, which have a role to play. For example, business associations or local business associations that drive cluster development, for example. So there's a competence of the people who are managing these institutions and the institutional memory, which is often a problem in India. Officers change, things fall apart. The second thing is the institutional strength, which is how accessible that institution is and to what extent it is accountable to its terms of reference. The third is the credibility of the institution. And here we are basically discussing its capacity to deliver regularly on its terms of reference, and more importantly, the trust it has. So even for a business association, do the entrepreneurs trust that business association to inculcate, for example, intersectoral cooperation or drive such programs? And the other big point that emerged was on the legal ecosystem. So that's a big issue. So contract enforcement, rule of law. Dr. Bhalla also mentioned these issues. The whole issue of judicial reform. To what extent can we really drive that? Are there alternatives to that we could look at? So this is the gamut of kind of things that we discussed last time, I think, which is up for discussion again for this panel. The entire point remains is that the focus is on domestic reforms and on micro level issues. It is not about, as Dr. Bhalla, I think, very eloquently pointed out, about tweaking, tariff rates or other such areas. It's about plumbing in the economy, that deep dive that we need to do to address the specific issues that plague education policy, governance, legal ecosystems, and all of these put together the competitiveness of the economy. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Preetham. With that, let me now turn to Vidisha. Vidisha, over to you, 5 to 7 minutes. You heard both Dr. Bhalla on the micro and Preetham recalled the discussion we had, which had been put forward in the white paper as well.
Sure. Thank you so much and good morning.
Let me give me a minute. Let me again remind all the panelists that they are welcome to comment on the white paper later. And for the audience now, they can put in their questions through the chat box. Thank you. Thank you. Over to you, Vidisha.
Thank you. So yes, I have listened to the earlier session, and I think a lot of very good points were made. And again, as summarized by Preetham, on the implementation issues, the problems with contractual sanctity, and the lack of skills in city level administrations is some point I liked. Another point which industry keeps lamenting is the failure to pay them on time, and as a result, they are really cash constrained because various entities, from state governments to state level PSUs to sometimes even central level PSUs and organizations, do not pay on time, despite there being a law stating that at least they have to pay the MSMEs on time. So that is one really big problem. There are other issues in the implementation area. Let me highlight a few, like say the GST or even customs duty that was talked about. It is really not a matter of protectionism. The issue is about complexity. The customs duty rates are so many that it's really difficult to even find out, and it leaves a lot of space for arbitrage. Even in GST, there are so many rates that one can easily move to a much simpler 3-tier rate in both cases, and that will make it much simpler for industry to compliance to increase. Second point, which is very relevant now, is on the vaccines. We have huge vaccine availability, which is really an advantage for India, and yet we are falling short of delivering the vaccines to the people because of an administrative failure. I mean, we are vaccinating quite rapidly, but yet we are, given that we have a huge population, and we now actually have a surplus of vaccines. Earlier, we thought that in the initial period, there would be a deficit, so we keep it to the health workers, and slowly, as more vaccine availability increases, the rest of the population can be vaccinated. However, what we find now is that there is actually a surplus of vaccine availability, and still they are not being used. So really this is an administrative failure in the same line as what we've been talking about. So really important to monitor, especially even for the private sector and particularly industry associations like us. We would like to monitor a lot of the good things that have been announced in the budget, for example, say the infrastructure investments, the disinvestment, the privatization, which we welcome very much, but we really hope that these are implemented in the spirit that they have been announced. Now, coming to the issue of competitiveness, I mean, we all know the factor markets where India faces much higher uh, prices or costs across areas like infrastructure itself is one of the biggest disadvantages that Indian companies face. Then, and here I'm not talking about only the hard infrastructure of roads, railways, etc., but also the soft infrastructure of health and education and sanitation. Fortunately, the pandemic has thrown some focus on these areas, and these hopefully will be taken care of. Then the whole issue of logistics. In many manufacturing sectors, what we find is that while within the factory there is a competitiveness exists, the moment the goods exit the factory, there is a huge problem in logistics and delivering that product from the factory gate to the customer, whether it is a domestic customer, but particularly for exports, where you need much quicker turnaround time. Then there is the issue of power. Power tariffs are higher that we face. Then capital cost is also higher in India. There many surveys have pointed out that investors require about a 4% additional return in dollar terms to convince them to invest in India. Maybe it is changing now. This was some time ago. We have seen the tide turning in terms of FDI, and possibly this cost of capital has been coming down. And finally, also one thing I want to point out, that all these issues of power, logistics, land availability, these are all, a lot of these are state level issues where, as we discussed, that there are differences across states. But there's one issue which is within the central domain, and that is in the financial sector. And there, we have had a slightly sort of a lethargic financial system where credit availability has been a problem. And I think the government has, in this budget, taken forward quite a few, announced quite a few changes which will help address the problems. So privatization of public sector banks, which is really absolutely, it was not expected, but has come in the budget. And as we all know, the public sector banks have problems in terms of governance autonomy, in terms of HR autonomy, and of course the investigative agencies that are always threatening to put them to examine all past histories of any decisions taken by the bankers. All these issues would have been really hampering the public sector banking system. Other than that, there is the creation of an asset reconstruction and management company, which will hopefully take care of the bad loan problem that is there in the system. And also a development financial institution has been announced for infrastructure investment. Of course, there could be many implementation problems and roadblocks as these are taken forward, and but at least the initial ideas are good and could help to solve some of our problems. Human capital has also been mentioned, extremely important to develop our at the bottom level as well as at the higher level. So basic primary reading and writing skills, and also research and development at the higher level. So finally, I'd like to say that this we all look at the East Asian miracle and say that that is what we missed the bus and that is what where we should catch up. Yes, we should catch up, but I think we should also just look at the situation, the current world economy, and see where the opportunities lie. Is it possible to really replicate that kind of labor-intensive, export-oriented manufacturing growth, or should we look at a mix of manufacturing and services? And technology, where a lot of changes are happening, and India has an inherent advantage in the human resources. And also there is this phenomenon of servitization of manufacturing. So, the two can't really be distinguished anymore in the way that it could be at the time when, say, China developed its manufacturing sector. So I think I just end with that thought.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Vidisha. With that, now let me request Shankar Acharya. Shankar, there were very important points raised by all the preceding speakers, including by Preetham, in terms of what was discussed and what was the outcome document that we shared with all of you. Over to you, Shankar.
Thank you, Pradeep. First of all, I'd very much like to congratulate you on the title of this set of seminars you have, where you call it Competitiveness for Inclusive Growth. Because in my kind of now rather long and ancient history of interacting on these issues, I've generally found that those people who talk about competitiveness and trade and trade performance and industrial performance are in one box, while those who worry about growth being inclusive, think about employment issues, poverty alleviation, and all those tend to fall into another box. I'm not saying that, of course, they only think about those. These are all competent people, and so they think widely. But those sort of boxes do come through in their research and other writings. And I think that by putting them together, you're doing a good service, Pradeep, because in my view, at least, I would say the two go together very well. And I would go so far as to say that any one who's serious about inclusive growth really has to realize that one of the key preconditions to that is how to run a competitive economy, how to make the best use of one's factor endowments, whatever they are, whether it's labor or capital or human resources or whatever. And without a competitive economy in all its manifold dimensions, you will not be able to solve the problems of having more employment, more inclusive growth, more poverty alleviation. I think the key transmission belt here, in my view, and there are obviously many, between the efficiency and growth set of box, if you like, and the poverty and deprivation set of box, if you like, is jobs and employment. And essentially, a fast-growing economy, which is truly arising out of competitiveness and competition, not just in external, but also in the domestic markets, generally has been successful in delivering rapid job growth and decent rapid job growth. And those that have not succeeded. I think we fall a little more in the latter group than in the former. So that point I would like to make very strongly. The second is, in my opinion, if one is looking at an economy as a whole, well, obviously there are many indicators one should be looking at. But the simplest one, I would say, is that look at what is happening to the ratio of exports to GDP. In particular, perhaps I would focus a little more on merchandise exports to GDP, but even the merchandise plus services to GDP would also suffice. And that's essentially because if you're running a competitive economy in an international world, after all, where we are under $3 trillion economy and the world is a $80+ trillion economy, you ought to be competitive in the world if you're going to really continue to succeed and sustain strong growth of everything. And if we look at what's been happening, we were doing pretty well between in these simple ratios that I have suggested, between, let's say, the early 2000s and 2012 or so. And after that, I'm afraid, or 2013 maybe, after that, we've done rather poorly. And particularly in the last 6 or 7 years, we've done very poorly. This ratio has come steadily down. And that's obvious because if you look at, just remember that our annual exports of merchandise exports in the last decade or so, or last 7, 8 years certainly, has fluctuated around $300 billion. And monthly has been somewhere around $25 billion. It's been up and down, obviously. Now, if something stagnates, whereas in the numerator, whereas the denominator keeps growing, the ratio will fall. And that's exactly what's happened. If I remember very roughly, we used to have exports to GDP share of above 25%, 8, 9, 10 years ago. And I think the last I looked at it a year or so ago, or maybe 2, it was below 20%. And in fact, the drop is sharper if you look at just merchandise exports. I can't remember the numbers offhand, but it's easy to look up. These numbers are very readily available. So I'm afraid that my reading of what's been happening is that what I regard as the simplest and easiest indicator of is the economy competitive, we've been doing badly on in recent years. And that worries me enormously. I should, as an aside, just say that I'm afraid I completely disagree with what Sujit Bhalla has said on his numbers. He talks about tariff rates, average tariff rates of 3 to 5%. Everything I see in, say, something like WTO Trade Review or recent paper by Arvind Subramanian seems to be more like 12, 13, 14% and going in the wrong direction, that is increasing. So that's one. And on the role of the other point that he made on exchange rate, of course, I would really recommend to everybody his 8, 9-year-old book, Devaluing to Prosperity, in which he takes a very different view on all this and at great length and very persuasive. And now, of course, everybody's free to change their mind, but makes one worry if that happens too often. I very much sympathize with the view of that he writes so eloquently about in 2012 or 13, whenever he published that book. I am afraid his conclusions today are not the ones that I would have much sympathy with. And if he wants to, he kind of says that there isn't any research on this. Well, that's just not true. There are papers by not just Arvind Subramanian, who I mentioned, but very recent good papers by Sajid Chenoy and other young scholars who point to the strong relationship between exchange rate and trade performance, particularly exports. Now, the other point, a couple of other points I'd make is that in having a competitive economy, and this has been reflected in the remarks by several of the other speakers who've spoken before me, that a lot of what we have to do, of course, is internal. It's not as if we're tinkering only with tariffs, though hopefully downwards, is going to solve our problems. There's a huge amount that has to be done, whether it's infrastructure, logistics, or the competence of the state. I think this broad concept of the competence of the state is enormously important, whether it's at central or state levels. And if, again, one looks around at the world and one sees which are the countries that have run really well over long periods, or even let's take in handling the challenge of the pandemic, the COVID pandemic. I think it's been countries which have shown enormous competence, as well as strong economies, strong, resilient economies. And obviously China is one. even though that was the source of the original problem in terms of the geography of where COVID-19 came from. Obviously, South Korea is another, Taiwan is another, New Zealand is another, Germany is another. I mean, the list is not long, but it goes on. And I think that a very distinctive feature of all these few, maybe, I don't know, 8 to 12 countries, is that their state competence at all levels is extraordinarily good. So that the ability to handle the two different dimensions, one, the actual pandemic and controlling it, and minimizing its spread and longevity, as well as the other of keeping the wheels of the economy moving without shutting down everything for a long time and so forth, is remarkable. And that resilience showing up. I mean, after all, why is it today that when we look at the IMF forecasts of what's going to happen to growth in the world, country by country as well as globally, show that, if I remember the numbers again, my memory is not what it used to be, that I think China is the only large economy in the world that is expected to show something like 2% growth in calendar 2020. And what's more, that they're expected to show growth around 10% or so, I think, or 8%, I've forgotten, 8 to 10% in calendar 21. Which is a very different set of numbers from all other large economies. You just have to tabulate it, and it'll take precisely 2 minutes to do that if you look at the basic table and say the IMF World Economic Outlook there. So that's, I mean, I think this issue of the state level competence is enormously important as well. Just to share with you, while I have the floor, and I hope I am not overstepping the time, my own view is that of our prospects for growth recovery and so on is, of course, in the coming fiscal year, that is 21-22, we will have a statistical rebound, which is very strong. I mean, if you drop by 8%, 9%, whatever it is finally, I mean, latest official estimates everybody's seen is 7.7. It might be more, as many are saying, when informal sector outcomes are actually included later. Take it at 8% now. Then statistically, if you recover back to where you were a year ago, you straight away get 9% growth in the coming year. And another percent or 2 or 3 above that gets you into double digits, which is what I've been predicting for about 8 or 9 months. That I think back in June, I said that India's economic growth in FY 21-22 is likely to be in the order of 10 to 12%. It's published. And that's, I think, where it will be still. I did predict that the decline would be, for a full year, would be larger, and not 8%, but more like 10% or so. And there, I think I'll be very happy if the decline turns out to be around 8%. But that's to be yet seen, because the CSO's numbers at the moment are very much the tentative ones, when they only have 7 months data to work with. But what really worries me is not so much what's going on in growth. Oh, sorry, and growth, one more point. Beyond FY 22, that is 21-22, I am bearish, because I think the big problems that face us are not being adequately addressed or solved. I mean, in my mind, these relate to a number of things. We'll have a huge fiscal overhang and debt overhang. And again, contrast to Surjit, I do believe that issues of high debt and high fiscal deficits constrain growth possibilities in the medium term. They have for us in the past, they have for most countries in the past, and I think they will in the future too, despite the so-called modern theories on some of this stuff. Secondly, as I think Vidisha or somebody else mentioned, our financial sector is hugely stressed. The RBI itself, as you know, expects in its financial stability report that the NPA level will rise to somewhere around 13-14% in its central forecast, and it could get worse. And that I don't think, I mean, I think the privatization of PSU banks that's proposed is very good. I welcome it. And a couple of other measures they suggest are also good. But these are very much at the moment ideas It'll take a long time for them to be implemented. How well they're implemented, we don't know. So essentially, I think we'll have, for several years ahead, a highly stressed financial sector, and its capacity to sort of intermediate funds from savers to investors is going to be highly constrained. So that's going to be also a big
Thank you very much,
break.
Shankar.
Okay, so let me just leave you with that. And my last, just one point,
Sure,
Pradeep,
please.
which is where my worry is the greatest, is what's happened to employment, or what is happening to employment, particularly low-level employment. I mean, as we know from the 2017-18 labor force survey, it was, the worst labor market indicators for the last 50 years. And since then, the economy has slowed, and then we've been hit by COVID. And I don't see, and in fact, what's happened as a COVID is the cost has been of the cost of COVID and output loss has been hugely disproportionately borne by the bottom 50% of our earners and citizens. Thanks a lot, Pradeep.
Thank you, Shankar. It's always a great pleasure listening to your erudite and very brilliant ideas and comments and views. And that is why you've taken a substantive amount of time, which I thought was very well deserving. So let me now request Gopal Agarwal, economic spokesperson for BJP, to respond. 8 to 10 minutes, Gopalji.
Thank you, Pradeep ji. It has been an.
You heard all these peoples. Yeah.
It was enlightening to hear all learned panelists before me, and they have enlightened me a lot. And always these kind of seminars with cuts and your inputs are always helpful. My job from here has been made easy. I'll pick some of the points which I will highlight for my presentation here. Is Bhallaji has said that about the protectionism is not a big custom duty, import duty. I think this is also my opinion, that custom duty, etc., is not a big hindrance to the competitiveness. And Vidisha ji has also pointed out, highlighted about the factors of production. That is also a point that I would briefly deal with. And Preetam Banerjee about issue of reforms. I'll pick 1 or 2 points from there. And I like Dr. Shankar Acharya's approach on this current seminar about this boxed approach of competitiveness and inclusive growth. I also feel that from here I'll start. My point is that political economy is one of the major factors which is affecting the economic growth in the country. Because on other issues, there is a quite consensus that we need reforms, we need improvement in factors of production, etc. Economists, everybody is agreed on that, and government also has a similar kind of thought. But the problems comes based on political economy and the narration, which is a big factor currently in India, which is hampering the whole economic ecosystem that we all have an important responsibility to do. There is I think over last 50, 60 years, India has been bogged down by crony socialism. And this is one thing where every reform requires a lot of spending by political capital by the decision makers. And this is hurting everywhere. Now also, after this agriculture reform, this has been coming down when there is a consensus on these issues. Still now, even today I was reading some of the papers, has Narendra Modi committed too much political capital on agriculture reforms? When there is a consensus on political reforms, everybody wants that agriculture market has to open. We need competition in the agriculture market. We need private investment. We are hampered by private investment into the capital formation in the private sector. When there is so much consensus, still it is becoming so much difficult to implement where there is such a large consensus. So the narration in India And crony socialism is one thing that I think is one of the biggest factor where reforms and the roadmap ahead is being hampered at the political class. This is an important issue. How to deal with it? All economists, and they have to create narration on that point. Then only the consensus which is arrived at the political class can be implemented, because politics and democracy is what it is in the country. On the issues of increasing competitiveness, factors of production is everybody is agreed that they need improvement. On the reform agenda, there are no low hanging fruits. Earlier also it was said in your seminar, Pradeep ji, that now there are no low hanging fruits available for reforms in economy. We need to go for major reforms. I very sure that now when the labor reforms will be implemented, there will be a big agitation. So how to deal government becomes at the government side, it becomes difficult. uh, Data is another issue. There lot of thing has to be done on the government side. Access to data, I have also find at point difficult that government departments etc are reluctant to share data. Without data, proper data and access to data, though certain data are being opened for public domain and increasing, but this area has to be implemented. And what Pradeep ji you said about the bureaucracy from top to bottom level is also an important factor, which government is also concerned. GST had a very good, when we talk about GST, it is the conceptual level that GST is perfect. But at the implementation, I agree with Vidisha ji that slowly and slowly human intervention is entering every aspect, and subjectivity is getting into this aspect, and that becomes a complicated issue. About the government is concerned, we are looking into it. How to smoothen and completely remove subjective intervention, but when at the implementation level, lot of administrative people are involved, and they successively intervene and get the whole theme change into that gives the power to them, that discretionary power they always want. So that has complicated GST and other reforms, but slowly government is well aware. We are discussing on that. I also want one more area that we need to focus is about standards and IPR. Indian standards institutions are required, and there we are thinking and working, and on this with regard to this contract enforcement also, where a lot of work needs to be done. So on these factors of production, the government is working on 5 policies, and I think that will tackle major bottlenecks that are coming with regard to this logistic cost, with regard to power, this new industrial policy, new this foreign trade policy, then logistic policy, e-commerce policy, retail trade policy. Government is working on them, and these 5 policies will in near future come out with the thing. On the issue of ideological point, I just would like to mention that as a BJP, we believe in market economy. We are right to center. We believe that private sector has an important role to play in the economic formation. We have to be more assertive. From this budget and the recent, what the Prime Minister has been saying, this is coming out. And this is, I am a very, I think this is a very encouraging position, that the due place that the private investment, private businesses or wealth creator gets that due place for the public narration. So these were some of the points that I wanted to mention. at the government level, the biggest challenge that is hindering economic reforms is the public narration and the consensus on reforms which the government implement, and that is a responsibility of all of us to change the narration on the political economy and completely segregate or implement what this topic today is said, that just inclusive growth cannot come without wealth creation. So if this happens, many of the reforms, etc., are well known in the government circle, political circles, and Prime Minister Modi has the willpower to implement them. But for any political outfit, how much political capital they spend on this is always a challenge and a factor to be remembered. So if the public narration improves, I think the whole area will improve. That was the initial remark that I wanted to give. If any questions you have, we can further deal, because I'll not talk about factors of those are very clear on the thing. How is ease of doing business being implemented, contract enforcement, tax compliances, then other factors. On from Vidisha ji and other, I think financial sector is surely a stress one. And for that, I am of the opinion that FRDI should be brought into the this financial sector. That is one area where it will ease for the exit route and give more transparency in financial sector. DFI, I'm also very hopeful that DFI and the ARC and new law will further help. But IBC has to be moratorium on IBC implementation should go as fast as it is possible.
Thank you, Gopalji. There is one important comment and a need to build that narrative. You spoke about crony socialism, and we are talking about reforms. The narrative which has to come out from the government is that these are market-friendly reforms and not business-friendly reforms. Then otherwise you fall back into the the same label. This is what I've been speaking to some of the ministers, that please use the term market-friendly rather than business-friendly, because then it will show you in the same light as the other governments have been doing. With that, let me now.
Pradeep ji, एक बात मैं और कहना चाहता हूँ.
हाँ, please.
This is what I am telling you, because 3 agriculture laws.
Market-friendly.
The
exactly.
2 are to attract private investment, and it will help private businesses. So I think we have to be more courageous in our response. This is a business friendly. This will attract. What is the problem with if we put into we want private investment, we want private capital formation, we have to respect wealth creator. So I think publicly this narration or mindset needs to be changed, that why wealth creators should not be respected.
No, I agree with you. And market friendly would include not only the private sector but also consumers, which are often ignored. Even in the agriculture reforms, there was no discussion about the benefit which consumers will deny, except in a very unobvious manner. And that is something which, so therefore when we say market, it comprises of consumers and businesses both. And business friendly alone could, as I said, mean similar that cronyism, which is what has happened. This is my request. But anyway, we'll come back to that later. Let me request Ashima Goel.
Thank you, Pradeep. It's been very interesting listening to this and to see sort of similar views but also disagreements. So I think I'll start with your white paper and the focus there on concrete solutions. So I'm going to use the few minutes to flag what I see are the critical problems facing competitiveness and suggest some concrete solutions. First, I think that when we see in the 2010s, industrial growth is really slowed, investment slowed. You cannot have competitiveness if firms are not investing and upgrading. So my own view is that there has been too much focus on structural reforms. As Gopalji was saying, the low-hanging fruit is over, and the reforms now are those which affect large groups of people and lead to resistance. It's very difficult to change the narrative when people are affected. So I think for now, the focus has to be on counter-cyclical macroeconomic policy that smooths shocks. We've had too little of that in this past decade. Then the second issue is poor infrastructure. And here, the reason all the issues came up in the financial sector is that we haven't solved the availability of long-term finance for infrastructure. And here, some concrete suggestions are to allow long-term money, attract long-term money, whether from India or abroad, into the financial sector. New instruments such as REITs, where the government is taking the operational risk, and because that becomes very large in infrastructure. Then use of government warranties and building plug-and-play facilities for MSMEs, etc., training for them. But here I would just flag that I think we've done a lot on the financial sector. And overall, we are seeing that the performance is much better than expected in the economy, than analysts had widely expected. They had expected banks to collapse with a huge rise in NPAs. So I disagree with Shankar, and this is the predominant view. I think we have done enough so that banks are very healthy. The RBI's, it was not a forecast, it was just a scenario, and based on our performance in November. So I think the financial sector can develop as we go. It's not that you have to do something big. As I said, be careful of very big reforms now. Just do the counter-cyclical kind of steps required. So then the other major constraint is costs of doing business are high in India. And here I think there's a fundamental change. One is with DBT, and the second is that with WTO, now we reach a per capita income level where helping the poor through distorting prices, which also distorts allocation of resources, is not acceptable. We will have more and more action against us as a country if we persist with that. So the same thing with MSP also. We have to think now. We can't, that it is much better to give transfer to farmers through DBT, through income support, rather than price distortion. And other reforms like labor, even these farm laws, it's better done by stealth, reform by stealth rather than upfront. So by inducing competition among states, maybe setting up an interstate council, the GST has led to a lot of dialogue, and a lot of participants in these seminars have flagged that you need to improve the regulation in states also. So I think this Finance Commission has done well in giving incentives for reforms. The 12th Finance Commission had done it earlier for state debt, and that had really worked. Then the fourth issue I'd like to flag is over-regulation. Regulations are too strict in India. And in a way, this was also cyclical. It was a response to a lot of corruption cases, legacy issues, and the Kingfisher failure and so on, the whole push for infrastructure using public sector banks. So I think that there also the 3 tiers of governance and better coordination across this, because we have a history of a large number of state institutions all dealing with the same issue, so that you can't get anything passed without coordination, but anyone can stop something. So here also, I think for regulation, to emphasize counter-cyclical regulation, and to use macro, and there's a whole literature on this macro and micro prudential regulation, which creates better incentives for the regulated and reduces discretion, which really creates problems as well as delays, as well as corruption. I think the use of criminal penalties in commercial activity has had a very, very adverse effect on activity and must be reduced. That is happening. Compliance costs should come down. So then the fifth issue I'd like to flag is, so far we've always been talking about what the government should do, what regulators should do. But I think industry also has enormous responsibility. So the emphasis on corporate governance, transparency. One reason the corporate bond market is not taken off in India is that we don't have enough corporate transparency. Very few corporates who have reached that standard required. And today there's a focus on ESG as well as, your skill building, creating a dedicated labor force, standards, uniform standards are not there, quality, all that. And this, so the final issue I'll flag is incentive, export competition. We have had an unlevel playing field for our industry because we've asked them to compete with the world without, when they have very bad, adverse sort of high costs because of this cross subsidization, and price distortions, and not failure of reform in the factor markets. So now we have a strategic opportunity with global value chain diversification, and to use some industrial policy to this PLI is but it should be time bound, so it doesn't lead to the kind of poor performance and slack kind of rise in cost that we had earlier when you had protection. Now this is time-bound protection. And I think that the debate between Shankar and Surjit, we've done some research which shows that our exchange rate now is quite close to equilibrium value. So while some depreciation does help exports, you cannot have too much because you're also dependent on oil imports that raises costs of production. So you need some depreciation maybe to stimulate exports, but you also need these other kind of incentives, improvement in costs of production, regulatory costs, reduction in all this, and using the strategic opportunity available to help manufacturing become competitive. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ashima. Another excellent presentation. And may I now turn to our last speaker, Vivan Sharan. Vivan, are you there?
Firstly, for putting me in this gathering of public intellectuals. I'm a relative minnow, and I'm always thankful for you for promoting younger voices in this community. So many, many thanks. Just on, I think there's a lot of ground that's been covered, so I'm not in an enviable...
Vivan, we need more of you.
Absolutely, I agree with that, sir. Just on this debate on protectionism to begin with, because I think anything to deal with competitiveness in the current context cannot be divorced from that. I think because the gains from globalization are inequitable, and we've seen a lot of young people and women fall out of the workforce in Asia, not just in India. I think a little bit of protectionism is par for the course. So if we are to be protectionist, I think first let's be honest about it and let's be strategic about it. And if we are to be strategic about it, what are the ideological rudders or markers of our protectionism which can foster competitiveness is something that we need to think about. So there are a few notions that we need to dispel altogether. One is this outmoded notion that national champions can somehow pull us out of this situation that we're in, help us grow, create jobs, lead to distributional efficiencies and overall welfare. I think we don't have to be so tempted to revert to industrial policy style of picking winners across markets where there is bound to be discrimination between foreign and the Indian, large and the small, and more generally the underdogs and the incumbents. And I think if we sort of look at the synthesized remarks of everyone who's preceded me, I think we can agree that there are inconsistencies between wanting less government discretion and at the same time persisting with an industrial policy approach towards the economy of yesteryear. We have enough concentration risk problems as it is. And speaking of the financial sector, just a few statistics. The share of A group companies, which represent the popular and liquid stocks in the BSE, their market capitalization rose to a record high of 93.7% in the first 4 months of this fiscal, compared to an average of 84% in the last 2 decades. And this is the COVID phenomenon, concentration of wealth and revenue and profitability and so on. The concentration risks among large caps as a handful of stocks are actually driving index momentum in the Nifty too. The Nifty gained nearly 47% from March 23 lows, basically led by stocks like Reliance Industries and Infosys. These two stocks, for instance, accounted for half of the total points added to the Nifty during the period. Again, the first 4 months of the fiscal. The other 45 Nifty constituents, and we know there are 50, that have earned returns since March 23rd contributed just about 1 to 3% each to the index's gain, and so on and so forth. And in this, sir, your consumer view, when customers can choose between different providers, they benefit. I think this is a well-formed hypothesis. Their ability to choose from different markets, from different offerings, services, products, forces firms to compete with each other. And choice is a good thing in itself. And of course, competition between firms also leads to increased productivity and economic growth. So we have to be very clear about protectionism when we veer towards industrial policy. And we don't have to have this China envy or Japan or South Korea envy. At least if we have that envy, we have to nuance it. To realize that most of the areas where they were able to compete and grow their national champions were areas where those firms actually competed on the global stage. The second, I think, to Mr. Agarwal's points, I completely agree on the need for a narrative and to be bold and courageous and actually embrace the market ideology. But related to that point, sir, is also the fact that we don't have to use the limited political capital that we have for reform to protect intermediaries. Instead, we have to give preferences to procurement, for instance, from real industries. For example, production-centric activities such as agri, mining, manufacturing account for over 50% of the value added in the Indian economy, whereas trade services account for only about 12%. And I know the financial sector has great deal to do with efficiency and so on and so forth. So I may count financial services an outlier here. But it's intuitive, really, that you don't need to protect distribution segments of the economy. For instance, if you did that in telecom, just think about it. In 1999, we liberalized telecom. Today, we have the lowest tariffs in the world and so on and so forth. Would it have made sense instead to protect telecom, which is a distribution level activity, the telecom service provision part of it? Or would it have made more sense over the last 20 years to put in our political capital to develop local manufacturing for core telecom equipment and infrastructure through WTO compliant incentives, allowances, and so on? And this is something we need to think about as we develop our ideology for reform in the future. Extrapolating this example to consumer goods, it makes little sense to protect retailers rather than manufacturers who can be supported through areas like state procurement, as I mentioned, particularly in areas like handlooms and handicrafts, which are dying, which are job creators, through production and tax related subsidies, incentives, and so on. And electronics make up nearly half of the retail value on e-commerce platforms today. If we had spent the last 10 years protecting or incentivizing that industry so that a lot of the phones and TVs and so on sold on Amazon, Walmart, Snapdeal are Indian, perhaps we would not be in a situation where we're still dealing with whether or not it is time for Indian retailers to adopt digitization. The third area, which I was very glad that, again, Mr. Agarwal also flagged, is the protection of private property. And, not to demean India, but India ranks 154th on registering property and 163rd on enforcing contracts in the World Bank's Ease of Doing Business Index. And these are two useful proxies to understand the protections that we offer to private property in the country. That's worse than Somalia and Pakistan, respectively. So it's food for thought. We don't seem to be in a mood to fix this. And I say this because of the way we are approaching the new economy. The impulses towards gatekeeping and resolving gatekeeping and conflict of interest issues as far as the government being an operator in this space is concerned, it remains problematic. There are areas such as the non-personal data governance framework that we are developing, where we must first strengthen protections to intangible private property like creative data sets, as well as for trade secrets, before we start to carve out exceptions, again, which will lead to discretion on behalf of the state in terms of what to expropriate and what not to in the name of public interest. We need to define that public interest properly in the new economy, because we have to realize public interest is not a unidimensional thing which constitutes only the social dimension. but also the economic and political dimension. And this is to the point of over-regulation, right? The regulators in this new economy must not become super regulators or judge, jury, executioners of the public interest in private property. There must be inbuilt safeguards, because public interest, like I said, has multiple dimensions, and we must discuss what those safeguards for the regulation of the new economy are, because some of the legacy issues in the old economy don't seem to be going away anytime soon. At least we can design a better future for ourselves. And lastly, I was very happy that the finance minister took this bold approach of not pushing us down the road that I think a lot of tax administrators want us to go down, which is to optimize resources and revenues in the short term versus the long term. We are lucky that this government has had the foresight not to increase the tax burden in the budget, particularly on corporates, despite this predominant perspective. However, this ideological pillar of this conservative or right of center government, as Mr. Agarwal also defines, must also begin to reflect in other areas of revenue collection, like auction of public resources. There is no room for privileging short-term thinking in India anymore over long-term strategic thinking in these kinds of areas. For instance, we have spectrum auctions coming up. On March 1st, the DoT will be auctioning several bands of spectrum. The TRAI, in its limited conception, has again recommended that we set our reserve prices for the auction of this spectrum at 492 crores per megahertz, per megahertz as the base price. Now, this is 2.5x Italy's reserve prices. This is 7x UK's, 14x Australia's, 30 to 40x Spain's. I mean, where do we even begin to better calibrate sort of a revenue maximization framework that is built on a long-term return rather than a short-term tax administration perspective? If this is the case where public auction of resources is concerned, so I think we need to look at some of these fundamental areas. There's been a lot of debate around these areas, and these transcend the macro and the micro, and these are questions of policy design. And I think, again, to Mr. Agarwal's point, I keep referring to him, but he was the last speaker. The way to reduce subjectivity in terms of how we administer policies and so on really lies in the design of those policies. And I would just disagree on one of the points that he's made on the GST being a well-designed framework. If the GST was a well-designed framework, we would not have the implementation difficulties that we have today, and so on and so forth. So we have to bite the bullet here, be market friendly, be courageous about it, and be strategically protectionist where we need to be. Of course, all within the confines of what is acceptable under the various treaties we are party to at the WTO, while understanding that other countries like China, etc., have gamed the WTO, but we cannot afford to do so because we've invested too much political capital in multilateralism, and we are going towards a world where the US, India, and other democratic nations will have to again bolster the status of multilateral institutions and international rules. Thank you.
Thank you, Viman. Thank you very much for another intervention. I'll come to you, Gopalji.
Can I say for 1 minute, 1 or 2 minutes, or you?
No, I'll come to you. But being the moderator, let me clarify, Viman. Gopalji did not say that the GST was a well-designed framework. What he said was an excellent concept, which is what we have also said. But he said it very clearly. It was a badly implemented, badly designed framework. I mean, you turned it around.
Right. Maybe I conflated conceptualization with design.
No. Yeah. No, we've been asking for GST and agriculture reform since many years on the basis of research. We want a single market. Having said that, let me. Sujit had Gopalji. Are you happy with my response? Thank you. I'll come back to you. But Sujit had a point. He wanted to make a swift comment before we have received a few questions, which I'll come to after Sujit has made his comment.
Just want to make three brief points.
3 minutes.
One on vaccines, that there's an excess supply. This is what Vidisha brought up. This is a problem across the world, and therefore it is not specific to India. I'm in Washington and I still haven't been able to get the vaccine. A lot of people are protesting, and I think part of this, I at least want the vaccine, but I think a lot of people are very skeptical of the state with the way they handle the entire COVID thing. I do not know an explanation. I'm just saying that the phenomena that you referred to is not specific to India. Second, on job growth, I basically, I don't know if Shankar is still there, but between 2004 and 2011, you had the fastest growth in India, regardless of who's compiling the data. And you had the slowest job growth in India between that time period. So I think we should be really, when we're talking about inclusive growth, etc., we should really be talking about the facts. Third, on trade growth, between 2011 and 2018, world trade was stagnant, did not grow by $1. So I think after 2011, trade growth has really slowed down across the world, and we need to study why that happened and why that might continue to happen. But and India actually increased its trade share because we grew at maybe 2% over that time period, whereas world growth was at 0%. On the exchange rate, on the protectionism, as far as the data, this can easily be checked. At least what I did, I looked at customs revenue, which is published by the Ministry of Finance in the budget statement. I took out oil taxes, and I took out gold taxes, as well as that from the denominator. And you do the math, it comes out 4%. So I don't know where 12% is being brought about. It's 4%, and maybe this is not the right calculation, then I'd like to know what is. The numerator is the customs tax collected from non-oil, non-gold, and the denominator is non-oil, non-gold imports. Last but not least, on the exchange rate, etc. Again, a detailed study, we did it in the HLAG, and take the Bureau of BIS data series on real exchange rate, which is the longest one and very reliable, I think. And it shows no change in India's real exchange rate for longish period. Every year you get fluctuations up and down, and yet export growth in India really declined with the real exchange rate. And indeed, our real exchange rate was the fifth from the bottom in terms of appreciation. So, I think it's important we look at the numbers rather than go with preconceived notions. That's all. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Srijit. That is excellent. And I think we've offered you a lot of input for your next column. Now, let me now raise a few questions which have come from the audience. One is that bureaucrats who want to do a good job are transferred out if they don't sing to the tune of the political powers. How do we tackle this? Frequent transfers don't give any reasonable time. The issue about tenure permanency, this has been going on for a long time. And just to give you an example from Jaipur, the chief secretary, one of our best performing officers that I know of, D.B. Gupta, his term, before he could retire, the 3 months short of the term extended, he was removed from the post of chief secretaryship. And the person who replaced him, I have nothing to speak about him. I'm giving you an example of somebody who was very good. And so this continues to happen. This is a major, major question in terms of the kind of structural, how do we bring in those structural reforms which can create a little more honesty of purpose in the government, including in politicians particularly. The second question is, again, now it's a truism that, growth needs exports. So nothing to add. And now there is a very specific question which has been asked by somebody from the audience that uh, you know, he says one of the positive contributors to exports to GDP ratio are the merchant export from India scheme and the services export from India scheme under the foreign trade policy. Whether government should continue these in the coming FTP or not? That is the second question. And the third coming from Mr. Didasi, which again goes back to the first question in a different way, is that we need government reforms and can have lateral exit besides entry, but the issue is really about the structures of governance, which are set in stone, even though it is organic. How can we change the structures of governance? Similar to the first question. So who would like to go first in responding to these questions? Gopalji, you want to go?
I would just, before I answer the points that I wanted to add briefly in 1 or 2 minutes, I would like to add on is that the governance structure, administration structure and institutional strengthening will happen from strengthening tribunals. I have been following this because I think that's an important point that I missed. I wanted to tell that the stakeholders' opinion has to come through tribunals. And this is also a problem from the administration side, that tribunals are not being fully implemented, and slowly bureaucracy is getting overpowered and entry into these tribunals. Otherwise, all taxation tribunals, many of the tribunals we see that they are formulated to have the stakeholders' opinion, but slowly I see in their composition is that bureaucracy or ex-bureaucracy are getting into their hold. So this is one thing that can be in relation to what you said. And second point on the administrative reform is that bureaucrats also and senior officers have also to change their mindset that they are good administrator, but domain knowledge has to come from the technical side. So how do you go? The one lateral entry is one way, but then slowly we need more technical qualified people into senior administrative posts that can help into strengthening the governance. Another point that I want to just tell is about the choice between capital expenditure and revenue expenditure. So this narration has also, people are talking about helicopter money, direct benefit transfers, etc. But revenue, if we look into 3 crises since independence, we had one Asian crisis in Atalji's time, then global financial crisis in UPA time, and now COVID crisis. In the first crisis, we dealt it through higher capital expenditure on golden triangle, everything. So and second was more, and later on we saw that the economy grew fast because it has a catalytic effect on many sector, demand, infrastructure, etc. But the second time, government went more for revenue expenditure, loan waiver, direct fund transfers. This time we have again chosen after the crisis to go for more for increasing the capital expenditure. So we have to look into this narration, because short term, still many people are saying that we should give more money directly as a revenue expenditure into the hand. This also has to be looked more into the narration. And the last point that I would like to put is about why do we chase so much of macroeconomic parameters? And we had serious differences with Arvind Subramaniam ji and Raghuram Rajan ji, when they were always propagating that chase macroeconomic parameters only. This is first important budget where I think this budget is made for India and is made in India. And we have not went into just choosing the macroeconomic parameters. This I wanted to mention. On in export incentive, definitely this new policy is coming out. We will any suggestion from cuts or anybody will surely form part of the government is on the process of collecting the suggestions on this import-export policy and other policies. Those suggestions will definitely form part. That's what I wanted to tell on this.
Thank you. Just one quick response on this budget in terms of macro issues. One thing this budget has been very bold and transparent is on fiscal deficit. That is a macro measure that we will not be shy, and that is something which Sujit had also raised in his own opening remarks at that point. Any other, Ashima, would you like? Yeah, Preetam?
Sir, on the specific point about the export incentives, I think first of all, the design of these incentives are anyway running into WTO issues, as we know. So I think we have the ability today, unlike previous years, because we have the digital box that we have with the GST data sets, with the bank related data sets, with the labor related data sets, where we can start rewarding value addition, we can start rewarding employment generation, we can start rewarding product diversification in ways we couldn't simply by using these databases. So even the governance issues of picking who will receive these incentives can be very easily and transparently addressed. I think we need to move there, and the debate has to go in that direction. And that another related point, which is that even PLI, and I really liked what Dr. Goyal was saying about this. But another important point here is the design of the PLI itself, because they are sectoral interventions, and they cannot be one size fits all. And what it cannot do is simply reward sales or revenue. It needs to look into issues related to value addition. To just take one example, if I can produce a mobile phone in this country by importing all my intermediate inputs and doing very little value addition, in my country, but the revenue from a unit of sale is very large, and if that is rewarded, then I'm actually creating a distortion in terms of the incentives that I'm giving. So this needs to be looked into. Some of this might run into WTO headwinds, because there are certain things you cannot do in terms of rewarding value addition, but there are ways around it also. This is a debate, of course. This is not the right forum or time to, but it's a debate that we need to have. Thank you very much.
No, Preetam, you raised a very important point in terms of value addition as to how you ensure that the support that you give to the industry is not violative of WTO principles. We had done a study for Ministry of Textiles many years ago on the US cotton subsidy. And we discovered that the US cotton subsidy totals up to 3.5 times that of the price of cotton. Now, where did they give the subsidy? Not to the cotton farmer. They gave it to the transporter, the ginner, and everything around it, so that they could not be challenged directly. And though, mind you, that the US agriculture has always been protected under the green box, in spite of that. And this issue had come up again and again at a later date. But then it's difficult to say that you are giving WTO non-compliant subsidies. And that is a point I think we should make to the FTP discussion this time very abundantly and very clearly, that this is how you should do it intelligently rather than unintelligently, and then end up enriching some lawyer. Who else would like to comment? Come in. Ashima, please.
Yeah. So just first on the question, I think this issue of knowledge is very important for bureaucrats rather than just administrative knowledge and domain knowledge. So getting experts in, but also the period, they have limited. When somebody good comes in and he starts learning about something, he's transferred out. So that is one issue. But then to come to, I agree. I think that people say it was very complicated, but then the states would not have agreed. They would not have agreed to a simpler structure. There's a political economy issue also, and I think the way that they have been meeting and refining and fine-tuning it and improving it to start something. It's better to start with something not so good and then improve it. Otherwise, you don't start at all. GST was delayed for so long. Then to come to the macro issues, I think this budget it's really good that it's focusing on capex, because we have some studies, the multipliers are much higher because over time The supply side is also improved, and also the monetary fiscal coordination, because as you're relieving bottlenecks and inflation reduces, the multipliers are higher because interest rates can be kept lower if inflation reduces. So that is why it's important to spend on capital expenditure. Another thing, when I was looking at the budget figures, this whole pressure on the government to spend more stimulus for the poor, I think it is partly sort of left to use it to redistribute. But also, when you look at the in-kind transfers that we do, food subsidy and other sort of support, it's very, very high, given that our expenditure ratio is about 14% or 13% on average, and 6% you're spending on all this. We don't have the room to do everything. So we have to spend very strategically. And I don't know what Gopalji means by chasing macro parameters, but I think it is good that the budget this time is not paranoid about the fiscal deficit. You're using the opportunity which the crisis gives you, and worldwide people are expanding fiscal deficits, and to bring those out of the off-balance sheet items onto the budget to make it more transparent, and also to show how much the government is really supporting all kinds of consumption through the economy. So it's not as if you're not doing that. But I think the tweaking, the marginal additional expenditure on investment is really good, but there the implementation is important. Yeah.
Unfortunately, Shankar had another meeting to go to. Otherwise, it would have been useful. Please.
Yeah. Ashima ji, I just wanted to tell you what was happening is what I was comparing was the role of central bank under the previous governors and the current governor. I think current RBI regime has focused more on the overall economic need of the economy, and earlier it was so much focused on inflation. That is what. So our governor was so much inclined to only focus on. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. You don't chase only macroeconomic parameters. You don't only chase fiscal deficit. If the counter-cyclical, what you said, that same thing I'm saying, that you have to be counter-cyclical in your responses.
Gopalji, I agree. The US Federal Reserve talks only about jobs. It doesn't talk about inflation. And that is something which we require a better narrative in India in terms of the jobs agenda, which is not happening. The kind of focused narrative on the jobs agenda, which includes how do you create job creators when you talk in terms of wealth creators. So some of the narratives, Gopalji, which I would like to meet with you personally to and how we can take this forward with the government, I could talk to you. With that, may I now request, there's another important question, Gopalji, to you, is when we talk in terms of supporting the private sector, unfortunately, what is not happening in our country is R&D. Private sector is not investing sufficiently in R&D in spite of all the tax incentives which are there, including what we talk about the academic and academia and industry linkages are very poor. And unless no country's economy or productivity or competitiveness can grow without these kind of inherent structures in place and institutions in terms of the expenditure on research. So what do you think that, how is it that you can impress upon the private sector to invest in R&D, whether it is under CSR or wherever you can talk about?
Pradeep ji, one point I just mentioned, that we need to have a more stringent Indian standards, because once that becomes more at present, our status of BSI, other institutions, IPR are quite not very strong, that industries, etc., have to follow them, even pollution, etc. So once they become more stringent and it becomes more on a penalizing them, financial penalties, etc., you see there has been a slight change in our policy with regard to environmental clearances, etc. At one point, it was this Pragati scheme of the Prime Minister just focused on that. So much of capital was just stuck into those projects, and it was just because of various clearances, interdepartment, etc., environmental clearances and other things, that ultimately a lot of capital was blocked. So this current environment policy also talks about more on the financial penalties, cost of any violation, etc. So one issue here is that we become more stringent on Indian standards, penalize people more, so that industry is incentivized into investing into this research, development, and other improvement. And a second thing is, I agree that what is required is about the this academia, and this current, in the current budget, government has allocated around 50,000 crores for research. Prime Minister is focusing on various innovation index, whether skill. Ultimately, in your report also, I saw that startup ecosystem, developing startup ecosystem is an important part. And over last 4 or 5 years, I have seen that the Prime Minister has been focusing a lot on reducing corporate tax for startup, giving Atal Innovation Mission, Atal Tinkering Lab, and even PSUs are being encouraged to put up their product process and processes complexities into public domain and support research into them, give support to new startups to develop product and processes. And PSUs are personally being, I was on the board of 2-3 PSUs. Prime Minister personally took a meeting in Vigyan Bhavan where he said that all PSUs should financially support, put out all the processes and products which are hampering their growth and development into public domain, ask universities and other things. So that is one area the government vision is there. The implementation has to be taken more seriously. And therefore, pharmaceutical industry is growing, and government agenda is there that we will have a global footprint in the pharmaceutical industry. Without research, development, IPR, cluster development, environmental clearances, all these policy reforms, I think, will come through these 4 or 5 policies that the government is trying to get into in a reform mode.
Hey, Gopalji, what you said in terms of the pharmaceutical sector, including all the flanking issues around pharmaceutical sector, are very critical. We endorse you wholeheartedly. But the only thing that I would like to disagree with you is to give any penalizing powers to the Bureau of Indian Standards, which is a very staid institution, by the way. It is not an effective institution which we have dealt with. We worked with personally. I've been on their various committees again from time to time. Now, in the last event, there's another talking about institutions which came up was, which is what I had raised was, do you know of a National Productivity Council?
Yeah.
What does it do? What does it do? Zilch.
All many productivity council.
No, Productivity Council should be the ideal vehicle to deal with and discuss the issues that we are discussing. You know, how do you improve productivity? But it does done some trainings, etc., etc. Now, all these institutions require an overall, including scrapping them, and that is what, if I'm sure if the Prime Minister knows this, he'll do that, knowing that he's a very decisive person.
No, he knows, because I was on the board of IICA.
I remember that.
Yeah. So Prime Minister, when I was joined, Arunji told, he at the first year was instruction that we need to close it. What it is doing, it is juggling, consuming all the money, and their big reform took place. I think they have become more of a parking space for the retired bureaucrats.
The same argument you took in place of tribunals, what is happening with all our regulators, and many of these institutions are parking lots.
So I think you can prepare from here a report on revamping all tribunals. I am very much sure that we need to put stakeholders into all the tribunals.
Thank you very much.
And that only will create. So you can put
No, thank you very much. this is where I said you have to bring in consumers which you have not been have been consulting. Farm sector, for example, one of the biggest beneficiaries are consumers. But where are the consumers in your debate? In your narrative, they are not there at all.
Yes.
And
Yes.
like even you have the Akhil Bharatiya Grahak Panchayat, you have your own homegrown organization with whom also we are working. But that has to be taken up forward, and therefore what you suggested in terms of stakeholder involvement is very crucial. And we'll take that on board and come back to you, see as to look. This is the to-do list that we'll come back to you with and see as to how we can progress on that. The floor is open to any other questions.
So can I leave? I have a meeting at 1 o'clock, huh?
Right. So if you want to take leave, you're welcome.
Yeah.
I think we've had enough discussion.
Giving this opportunity.
We'll continue to talk about this in the
Yeah.
next event also, which is on
Yes.
9th March. So if you can, join in even as an attendee, we'll be very
Yeah.
grateful.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hello,
So, I mean,
who wants to come in?
Vivan.
Vivan, yeah.
Very quick responses to a few of the things that have been said. Firstly, on the question itself of bureaucracy and so on. I think if you look at Madhya Pradesh's agricultural successes that we've all heard tales about over the last 10 years, double-digit agricultural growth and so on, if you actually drill down to the roots of that, you'll realize that there were some principal secretaries who were posted in their positions for up to periods of 6 years, which led to the stability required to actually grow the agricultural segment to a point where it became a best-selling sort of state in terms of that performance. So yes, there is very much a need for the political class to explain to the public every time a bureaucrat is shunted out before his or her term. And I think that is something that can easily be brought into the rules of the game as far as the administrative class is concerned. And I'm sure the ARC, which you referred to earlier, also has some recommendations on this. And there is this new system of 360-degree evaluation, which has been brought in by this government, which I have my doubts about looking at it from the outside, because essentially bureaucrats have a crab mentality. While they may work in the national interest, they like to pull each other down. And when you ask bureaucrats about opinions about their peers, it is only human and natural for you to bring down peers that you think are not status quoist or not or maybe think too smart of themselves and so on. So it's not really linked to performance, that evaluation. It is linked to perception. And until that changes, I'm afraid you can't really deal with the bureaucratic end of the spectrum. The second is on this aspect that Ashima ji mentioned of better to start with something than nothing at all. There, I would like to differ from you, ma'am. While the GST may be a good example of that, if we take that as an ideological point of departure for everything that we design, then we may end up again looking 100 years down the line with 100-year-old colonial era laws, or laws from the 2000s in 2070. And because we've seen repeatedly in our ecosystem that when laws are enacted, it takes a lot to actually begin to amend them, even in dynamic sectors like IT, where we have a 20-year-old law which was purpose built for enabling digital signatures to legitimize online transactions. That was the purpose of the law. It's a misnomer that it's an IT law. It's actually a digital signatures law. And we've amended it once in 2008, despite all the excitement around digital. And as a result, you have a lot of litigation, a lot of uncertainty in that ecosystem. A third point, which Preetham ji raised on value addition. Preetham ji, again, I'll differ with you while I agree with the overall emphasis of your remarks. Who determines the sequencing of value addition? Is it again the bureaucrat that you think is enlightened enough to be able to determine when an industry should put in more into value addition, when their market is ripe enough to actually invest here? And especially when you talk about the kinds of industries you want, the high-tech, high-end industries with the capital-intensive ecosystems that you need to build to be able to export or even produce at home. Who makes this determination? If it's made by the state, I'm afraid the value addition paradigm is something we have to do away with. It has been hard baked into all of our bureaucratic thinking over the last 20 years and has resulted in very little outcome. Look at what happened in single brand retail trade, for instance. what has happened with the inclusion of value addition in that FDI policy? Very little is the answer. If you ask the government, you please file an RTI of how many high value, high end technology goods have been selling through the SBRT ecosystem in India when the value addition phrase was so intrinsic to it, you will get your answer. And the last point I have is on the standard segment, which GKG left us with, which is that I completely agree that R&D has to be linked to standards, but we have to nuance it further. We have to time these standards in the development and going to market with these standards with market transitions. We can't force fit standards onto mature markets as we've tried to do in many instances, whether it is in the case of set-top boxes in the TV industry, whether it is in the case of so many other industries. And we have an opportunity in new industries like telecom, where we have a indigenous standard of low mobility, large cell, which the TSDSI has been trying to push, but hasn't got support from the telecom operators. These are examples where standard setting needs support so that you grow the standard in sync with the market rather than after the fact. And that, of course, requires capacity building. And completely agree with you, Pradeep ji, that the BIS is a redundant organization with 3,000 standards for manufacturing and maybe 100 or 200 for services for an economy that calls itself a services economy. So we need a real rethink on how we do standard setting in the country, how we represent these standards and sort of the research that we have around this in international fora, where we tend to send undersecretaries who know nothing about markets or about engineering or about standard setting to represent the country. I think that in itself is bordering on a complete lack of focus on national interest when we send under-equipped people to represent India on standard setting across all fora. There is not one fora that I can think of where we have adequate representation for a country of 1.3 billion, which seeks to be a superpower. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I have a
Ashima? No, Vidisha? Yeah. We're about to close, so comments are sharp.
I'm getting muted by okay. So I have very few just comments on some of the points raised. One on GST, I mean, the reaction that we need to start somewhere was absolutely fine when we began, but now it's been more than 10 years that we've come through, and I think it's high time that we did some kind of rationalization. On the export, the new policy, it's been long awaited, and what I hear from exporters is that they're getting extremely impatient with the fact that while this new policy of ROD TEP has been announced and apparently implemented from 1st January, the rates are still not known. So there is a fear that while the WTO non-compliant policies are being wound up, the new policy may not be as generous as that, and in fact it will be quite minimal, whereas it is supposed to compensate for all taxes and duties that are paid by exporters so that they can compete well, and that's not happening. Third point is on jobs. I think we really need data on jobs. We cannot evaluate how well we are doing without any the government data that comes out on jobs is, we are still talking about 2017-18 as the latest data point. Whereas in the US, you have monthly data and policies are constantly tweaked according to that data. So now we have private agencies coming up and giving that data. The government has made no comment on whether that data is good or good to go with or not.
No, people do rely on the CMIE data, right?
That's what I'm saying. That's a private agency which is putting out the data, and the government should at least comment on whether that is acceptable or not. What the government is also parallelly coming out with is formal sector data, the PLFS. Which doesn't tell us anything about the large, more than 80% of employment.
Does anybody else?
And one more point I had on the vaccine. I think Dr. Bhalla mentioned that this is happening everywhere, but I think it's slightly different in the West, where there is a lot of vaccine hesitancy, which is leading to this problem. Whereas in India, a simple thing could have really prevented it, which is to allow the private sector to come in and allow them to vaccinate people, because we have a different infrastructure. The private sector is very much dominant in the health services in India, which is not the case in the West. And therefore, we need to bring in the private sector to administer the vaccines. That's all.
Thank
from
you.
my side.
It
Thank you.
seems Sujit Bhalla has also left.
Yeah.
Can I have just one 10-second?
Preetham, sure.
Thank you, sir. So just to respond.
Not 10 seconds, 30 seconds.
Thank you, sir. So just to respond to Vivan, good point. I agree with you fully. I was not saying the bureaucrats decide, and it is not linked to investment decisions. My limited point was on export incentives and PLI, because there, if taxpayers' money is being used to reward you, it's being used to reward you for bringing in certain amount of employment generation, to bring in certain amount of productivity, and henceforth also value addition. Because as the example that I gave you, if I have a mobile phone unit, production unit, where all I do is get a almost a pre-developed unit and just assemble it together, but the final price of it is very high, and that is what is used to reward me, then I create a distortion in the system. So we need to be careful. Again, all those PLI schemes are in different sectors, and they will have to look at the sectoral requirements of how we. The best thing is that we have all the data. 10 years ago, this wouldn't have been possible. Today, we have all the data that we need to do this. Thank you.
Preetham, your 30 seconds have gone. Ashima, do you have any last minute comment?
Yeah, I was just saying that GST was debated for 10 years and it was not going anywhere. So it was an area where you really needed to start. And also this PLI, I think that the point I made about non-discretionary intervention is very, very important. There should not be a bureaucrat there judging things. You have the data, as Preetham is saying, to measure properly. You design a proper system. It should be time-bound and it should be implemented without bureaucratic judgment and delay, and discretion. Yeah.
Thank you. I think Gopalji was quite candid and blunt when he said that the GST implementation has been screwed up by bureaucrats. If I may use a bit of colorful language, it reminds me of Nani Palkiwala, one very famous post-budget speeches. He used to deliver post-budget speeches. Those of Vivan you may not know or may have heard about it. He used to do it in a stadium, in say BCCI Stadium, Bombay Cricket Club of India Stadium, or BCCI Stadium. And he defined that budget as a bureaucrat's revenge. So I don't know whether, Ashima, you remember this very famous speech that she made. This was in 70s or 80s sometime. But Nani Palkiwala was always very enjoyable.
No, but I think the point Gopalji made about ideology and the debate, I think we should recognize good things where they happen and not pull down everything. This crab mentality works also for
exactly.
policy.
Exactly. I agree with you. I mean, there are a lot of good things which are happening, and they need to be encouraged rather than being lumped up with the lumpen elements of the governance structure. With that, may I request Vipul Chatterjee, my colleague and Executive Director of Cuts, to please say a few words, Vipul, to thank everybody.
Thank you, Mr. Mehta. But before I thank our speakers, if I may, in a couple of minutes, make 2 or 3 very quick points. First is that, and this is because of our speakers, that in this forum, in this series, we are discussing various dimensions or aspects of competitiveness. We are not just doing that in respect to labor productivity or capital productivity. And that, I think, is a good thing. And the reason why I'm saying this is that if we look at the data, our total factor productivity over the last few years, it's growing. And it's growing at quite a good rate, actually. It's more than 3.5% over the last few years, and it's better than China, in fact. So it's not that things are not happening, things are happening. We need to do more. That brings me to my second point, and very briefly, we need to grow more. There is absolutely no doubt on that, and I think there is a consensus on that, broad political consensus on that. Because unless we grow, how are we going to distribute or redistribute? So that's the point which we have been making. And it's good that in this year's budget and before that, over a period of time last calendar year, we have taken a number of steps, policy reforms, which are putting ourselves decisively on the right of center in our economic story, which I think is good. And we have to make our reforms much, much more market friendly, taking into account the concerns, the aspirations of not just the business, but also consumers. And the reason why I'm saying this is because the world, and this is something which we need to recognize, that world needs, or rather wants us to grow and to grow more. And there is, it's very nicely put recently by the Biden administration that India is a leading global power and a net security provider. So what we need to do now is to create a better domestic compact for reforms, for growth to happen, keeping in mind how these reforms are going to help our, our citizens, the last person in the queue, so that we don't see growth in statistical sense, but also in real inclusive sense. With that, let me come to my third and final point, and I completely agree with Gopalji on this, and also other speakers. I mean, in some manner or the other, all of them have covered it. I would put it in this manner: implementation, 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 institutions, institutions, and institutions. We need to develop the capacity of our bureaucracy at the lower level, at the state level, at the municipal level, at the panchayat level. And that is something which I think it's high time to start doing that in a concerted, very focused manner at the all India level, keeping in mind the basic tenets of federalism. And unless we do that, next year we are going to enter into 75th year of our independence, and therefore the next 25 years is going to be very, very important for us to grow and grow in an inclusive manner. So on that note, let me stop here. I thank all of you once again for your participation, for your time. We are going to revise our white paper, taking into account the points which have emerged in today's deliberation, and send that to you. And we request you to read and send us your feedback. Our next program under this series is going to be held on Tuesday, the 9th of March. And we'll be grateful that if you can join us. I'm sure that it's going to be as enriching, maybe more, as it is today or the last one, which was held a couple of weeks ago. So on that note, thank you once again, and over to you, Mr. Mehta.
I don't have to add anything beyond what you just said. And just to highlight one very important point which you made was, this is a policy seminar rather than an economic seminar. So we would like to deal with policy issues which can help us to take forward the agenda that we've chosen to advance. With that, let me again thank you all once again.